I've been teaching psychology and human sexuality courses for about 20 years, which means I have an academic interest in queer identities, as well as a lot of students with these identities. I think for both of these reasons, it's always felt important for me to get this right, and I've been trying to get it right for a while. Long enough that I've had a chance to watch my attitudes, our attitudes, towards this topic shift over time. Let's take a snapshot right now. Think of a gay or trans person you know. Get an image of that person in your mind. How do you think they came to their identity? Do you think they were born this way, or do you think they grew into and chose this identity for themselves? Do you have your answer? Okay, great. File it away. We'll be coming back to it later. When I try this exercise, I think of Patrick. He's out and proud. Maybe that's why he comes to mind first. And I've only known him for a few years and not all that well, but in my mind, it feels like he's always been the way I know him now, including as a gay man. I suspect this feeling of mine is common, that a lot of us perceive that queer identities are inborn traits. I can think of a couple likely reasons why. One of them is that the narrative that queer people are born this way has been pervasive in our culture for decades. Another is that, in general, we tend to apply what Carol Dweck called a fixed mindset to people and assume that they mostly don't change. But now, recent research about queer identities is starting to call a universal born this way assumption into question. The idea of identity being on a spectrum isn't new, but these identities appear to be more changeable or fluid than we've long believed. But just because of the way our minds work, we might still be a little stuck in a fixed mindset that's having trouble coping with new ideas about fluidity. And I'm not talking about liberals or conservatives here, I'm talking about everyone. I think we can all benefit by reflecting on the stories we tell ourselves about how queer people come to their identities. So, let's start with a little science, tie it to a little history, and then add quite a bit of psychology, both about identity spectrums and fluidity, and about fixed and growth mindsets. Taken all together, these shed a lot of light on how we got here and where we can go next, towards a more expansive future. I happen to be a psychology professor, but like anyone else, I've been on my own journey, trying to work out my attitudes about these identities. My story starts in the 1990s, during the era of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the Defense of Marriage Act. It was a time when the average American was quite hostile towards homosexuality, and transgender people were barely on the radar at all. But it was also a period of exciting new research pointing to a biological basis for sexual orientation. Many studies found that homosexuality tends to run in families, suggesting a genetic component. Another researcher found a little cluster of cells in the hypothalamus that was different in a sample of gay men's brains, implying differences in neurology. Still others discovered that you can change the testosterone exposure of a newborn rat right at birth and change its mating patterns for the rest of its life, pointing to an early hormonal effect on the brain wiring responsible for sexual preferences. All these lines of research, and several others too, were coalescing into a picture of sexual orientation being determined by biology. All of this is super exciting to a budding young psychologist who thinks that science is the best way to understand our world. Science loves to categorize and explain things, and I am, in fact, a scientist. And of course, I'm not the only one in America taking notice here. The gay rights movement noticed this pattern of findings coming in and recognized it could be very useful. The Supreme Court, starting in the 1970s, had issued a variety of rulings against discrimination based on race and sex, because these are immutable characteristics, meaning traits that a person cannot change. That meant that if sexual orientation turned out to be an immutable characteristic, the court would have precedent to, later on down the line, rule against discrimination based on sexual orientation. I think this gives us some important historical context for one reason why the born this way narrative was pushed so hard, even relatively early in the story of the science itself. Because scientifically speaking, a lot of these findings are preliminary and tend to involve small sample sizes and don't always replicate, and a lot of them don't show up for women at all. But it was fine, I figured. It was early. And surely if we just are patient, give it more time, the science that has the answers we're looking for is going to come through. Well, it's been a few decades, and since then, there's not much new to report on the science front. We still haven't found the gay genes or the specific prenatal hormone recipe that creates a gay brain. We still haven't found predictors of homosexuality in women or bisexuality in anyone. And we're similarly in the dark about what leads someone, biologically speaking anyway, to be transgender. Some interesting anatomical and hormonal correlations have been found, but nothing reliable enough to be predictive. In the meantime, we've learned more about human sexuality, such as that gay men, for example, are more likely to say they felt different from their peers at an early age. Queer women are less likely to have that description resonate with them. In contrast, queer women, compared to men, tend to be more fluid in their sexual orientation, perhaps identifying as straight in high school, bisexual in college, or lesbian later in adulthood. We've also seen some interesting demographic changes over time. According to a 2022 poll by Gallup, nearly 1 in 5 Gen Z adults now identify as LGBT. That's nearly double that of millennials and about 5 times that of Gen X. So I find myself, especially as a scientist, pondering what this might mean. Because anytime you see a change this rapid in a human population, it is probably not biological. It is probably cultural. The usual explanation is that queer people have always existed, and it's when a society feels accepting of diversity that they feel safe enough to come out. I think that's part of the story, but can't fully account for such a large difference among people who are only separated in age by a decade or two. An alternate explanation is that having sexual diversity pervasive around you, especially among your same age peers, can lead you to introspect and possibly experiment and possibly discover that this identity fits you. Which is another way of saying that culture and life experience can affect sexual orientation or gender identity. Which is the opposite of saying that queer people are born this way. So this put me at a confusing point in my journey, and feeling low-key betrayed because I was led to believe that the correct opinion on this topic is that these identities are not a choice. Felt really stuck, trying to figure out how to reconcile the data I was seeing with beliefs I've held for ages. Eventually, I worked out a way to understand these findings as a cohesive picture, and in a way that doesn't make born this way versus flexibility and freedom inherently contradictory. It helps to break it down into two concepts. The first is the idea of a spectrum. Here's one for sexual orientation and another for gender identity. We can say that nature or biology placed you somewhere on each spectrum. I perceive that nature put me here at straight for sexual orientation and here at cisgender for gender identity. And I know that a line with 2 endpoints does not remotely do justice to the actual diversity that exists in this space, but please bear with me while I try to keep it simple. The second useful concept is the idea of fluidity. In addition to a starting point, we can say that each person is dealt a range of latitude in which they might move. Maybe only a little, maybe a lot. And then nurture, meaning your culture and environment, helps decide where within that wide or narrow range you might end up. For example, I perceive myself to be straight and narrow, meaning that even though I could hook up with women, I don't really want to, and that I also feel completely comfortable and content identifying as female. I don't perceive my own sexual orientation or gender identity as being very fluid, so I only hang out right here in this little skinny part of the entire spectrum. But I could have ended up a different person had I been handed a different starting point, maybe like this, or greater range, maybe like this, such that even if I had the same original starting point, this is depicting the fluid space that I could inhabit over the course of my life if I also had a social environment that supports that kind of exploration. In our world today, I see people wrestling with one or both of these concepts. For some people, it's the spectrum. They may might disapprove of homosexual or transgender people, or they might be good with tidy categories like gay, straight, male, female, but struggle with anything outside these binary distinctions. I think this is totally understandable, natural, based on how human brains process information. It takes effort and experience to learn to think in shades of gray or rainbow. Other people are totally comfortable thinking about sexual orientation and gender identity on a spectrum, but then get hung up on the fluidity part. And again, I don't believe this is an issue of tolerance versus intolerance. I think this is just one example of a mindset that is much bigger than this one topic and so pervasive in our culture that it touches nearly everything we do. If you aren't familiar with Carol Dweck's research on fixed and growth mindsets, I highly recommend it. It is seriously game-changing with respect to being able to learn new skills and grow as a person. Her observation is that Americans tend towards a fixed mindset, meaning that people's intelligence, talent, and other traits are innate and don't really change. We can see a fixed mindset in how we often celebrate geniuses and prodigies above people who have spent years patiently improving their skills. We can see it how when our children struggle with math, they often reflexively think that they aren't good at it, rather than reflexively thinking that they just need to study more. This fixed mindset bias is very compatible with another Western bias, one that I recognize very well, that we tend to prefer human phenomena that we can explain using biology. We tend to find all manner of differences, from obesity to drug addiction, more palatable if we can trace them to a biological cause. This is very clear with sexual orientation, where the belief that gay people are born this way is very strongly correlated with support for gay rights. This was great in the 80s and 90s, when we had to stop victim-blaming gay people for the AIDS crisis and end the horrors of conversion therapy. But attached to the born this way assumption is the idea that sexual orientation and gender identity are set at birth and stay that way. In other words, that they're fixed. And this assumption can trip us up in a variety of ways. For some people, it manifests as believing that you can't change your sex, that a transgender woman, for example, will always just be a man in a dress. But even in the scientific community, we can see this idea in a more subtle form. My current human sexuality textbook distinguishes between classical transsexuals, meaning people who have felt, usually from a young age, that they were trapped in the wrong body, and autogynephilia, referring to straight men who get into cross-dressing and grow into the desire to have women's bodies themselves. I'm not here to defend the accuracy of this model or its relatively outdated language, only to point out that it exists and to highlight that this first category that portrays gender dysphoria as an inborn trait feels more sympathetic, more legitimate somehow, more real. Whereas the second category, in which gender identity changes during puberty or even long afterward, sounds like a sexual fetish and carries more social stigma than the first. This bias in favor of inborn traits also affects people in other queer subcultures. Lesbians, for example, sometimes experience discrimination if they've ever had past relationships with men. Some women won't date them because they figure that you're not really lesbian. You're probably just experimenting or going through a phase. Gay men, by that same token, who have had past relationships with women, are usually assumed to have been closeted or in denial at the time, that they were still gay before, they just hadn't come to terms with it yet. In both cases, an assumption is being made that a person's sexual orientation was set at birth and doesn't change. Therefore, if it does change, the person must just be wrong at one time point or the other about who they really are. It puts some queer people in the odd position of feeling like they have to disavow their former selves just to fit into the fixed categories that our culture tends to offer them. So let's bring it back to the person you thought of at the top of this talk, a gay or trans person you know. What did you originally answer about how they came to that identity? That they were born this way or that they chose? Now take whatever that answer was and flip it. For example, if you had originally assumed that your gay friend was born this way, what if you later found out that they came to this identity over time, gradually through life experience? Try that idea on for size. How does it change how you think or feel about your friend? And for the most important question, should it? If we take this two-concept model, spectrum and fluidity, we suddenly have space for all kinds of stories. If we make a habit of assuming that a queer person was born this way, that might be true for them, but it might not be true. As queer identities become ever more common, and as the pathway towards these identities becomes ever more diverse, we would do well to develop a growth mindset. Not just about queer people and their ability to shift identities over the course of their lives, but about ourselves and our ability to shift away from mindsets that we've held in the past, no matter how long or how tightly we've held them. And as long as we're on the topic of fluidity and growth, here's one more thought. Science itself is fluid. The average person often thinks of science like this inert collection of facts and conclusions like you'd find in some dusty encyclopedia, but nothing could be further from the truth. Rather, science is a process that continually adds new insights to help us understand our world. If we know more now, as a scientific community or as an individual person, than we did 30 years ago, that is progress in action and a cause for celebration. Exciting, don't you think? What an amazing moment to be able to watch all this unfold and have an opportunity to move with it. When given the choice between stasis and growth, I hope to be a person who would choose growth every time. Thank you.